Welcome to the Learning to Die podcast.
I'm Ian Doonican.
And I'm Ciaran O'Regan.
How do I live when I know I must die?
We explore areas of philosophy, psychology, martial arts, culture, existential risk, history, society, religion, science, and anything else that seems of interest and relevance to answering that question.
We can only hope that some of what we learn might be of benefit to you too. Namaste, sapiens. Welcome to the Learning to Die podcast. Today we are joined by a very special guest, a man who has made some time for us, who is, I think it looks like he's standing outside against a wall, but he's not outside against a wall. He's inside. Mr. Greg Bennick, welcome to the podcast, Learning to Die. How are you?
Thanks so much. No, it's great. It's really, truly great to be here and to hear you say that, because I spent so much time this year working on my virtual studio in the loft where I live and making the background look so great. And the last 3 calls I had, the first one said, "Is that a virtual background?" So that means the lighting is so good that it doesn't look real. The second one said, "Where are you?" As if they thought I was like standing outside near the dumpster and the trash and back. And then you think that I'm standing in an alley. So basically what I need to do is take everything that I built this year, break it down and start over. So we've already made progress in how to apply ideas to my life today. And this is great.
I love it, man. There's something like with comedians, there's something about having that wall or behind you. It's something raw. But what's really interesting, Greg, those bricks that sit behind you, if I look out my window, even though it's very early in the morning, that's the same brick wall outside my window. So I'm just wondering if you're outside against the wall.
Yeah, it might be a virtual background you've got outside. You don't have no idea. It's like something like the Matrix or something. No, but I spent so much time lighting the back wall this year. Like, you have no idea, like buying the light and lighting the wall, only to have people think that I'm standing in the alley in back of my house. That's great. That's great.
There you go. You should go live down an alley. It might be cheaper and easier.
No, I mean, if I'd known this when COVID started, I would have just set up a camera in the back of the place where I live and just called it a day.
So Greg, where do you join us from today for our listeners? Whereabouts in the world are you?
I'm based in Seattle, Washington. So I'm in the Pacific Northwest in Washington.
Yeah, probably gets more rain than Ireland, Karen, does it?
I've been in Seattle, actually. I stayed there for a few days. It didn't rain once. I think I 3 days in the whole of 2016 that it didn't rain.
Well, if you're here between I would say May and October, it doesn't rain. I mean, other than that,
it rains in July.
Yeah, no, it wouldn't rain.
June, I was there. Yeah,
wouldn't rain. Yep, wouldn't rain. But if you're here in the winter, basically late October until late April or so, it rains every day. We never see the sun, and you start to go a special type of just out of your mind. So yeah, it's a good place to be in the summer for sure.
Such a cool place. And we were chatting off mic there, and I didn't realize you were actually in Seattle, but that would help to explain if that's where you had grown up, the punk rock that you were mentioning beforehand. Did you grow up in Seattle?
I actually grew up in Connecticut, and Connecticut and New York City had a huge punk scene when I was a teenager. Yeah. So I was going to shows at a club called the Anthrax in Norwalk, Connecticut, which is just iconic. Not quite as iconic in the mainstream as CBGB's was in New York City, but still iconic nonetheless. And when I moved out to Seattle, I actually moved here 3 or so weeks before the Nirvana album came out. So I moved here right when punk alternative in a mainstream context really exploded. So yeah, it's just been a whole life of that for me, essentially.
There's no point in talking to him about Nirvana. He wasn't even born then. you born when Nirvana came out. What year were you born, Karen?
89.
89. He was like two or three when Nevermind came out. I was in high school. I was cool. I had long hair like this.
Well, I love it. And you and Greg, with the music, what was your, because we're going to get to it obviously, but you're now, our link was that you're writing about Becker, right. Ernest Becker, but I'm actually fascinated about this music element and where did this you're giving a speaking tour about punk as well. So what's your deal with punk rock music? And I didn't know about this element.
Neither did I. Yeah.
I'll give you the abridged version, then we can dive in as much as you like, so it doesn't become entirely a punk rock episode, which I'm more than happy to do anytime. But I got involved in punk when I was
a good mosh pit, man.
Pardon? Say it again?
I fucking love a good mosh pit, man. So there's...
Yeah, there you go. There you go. So when I got involved in punk rock, it was in my teenage years. I was really excited at the idea of the integration and fusion of passion, energy, music, and ideas. I just loved that. And the bands that I liked were either weird or political or both, but just they were idea-driven bands. I was fascinated by that. So when I moved to Seattle, when I was maybe 20 years old, I started studying theater. And upon graduating from a theater degree with a focus on performance production and theater history, my professor, a guy named John Wilson, handed me 3 books on my graduation day, sort of as a send-off into the world. He handed me Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning,
Oh, yeah.
Otto Rank, Art and Artist, and Ernest Becker's The Denial of Death. Well, I did what any 20-year-old would do, or anyone for that matter, not even 20 years old. I mean, at 40, 50, 30, whatever, if somebody hands you 3 books at once, you smile, you thank them graciously, you go home and you put them on the shelf and you wait to read them someday. So a year later, he saw me on the street and he said, "Which one of the books is your favorite? How you doing with those books?" And I said, "Well, you know." And he looked at me and all he said was, "You're scared of those guys, aren't you?" And he walked away. And it pissed me off so much that he challenged me that I decided to read them. So I read Viktor Frankl's book first, and it was just an unraveling experience, changed quite a bit for me. And I started Art and Artist, and I found it to be absolutely impenetrable. And then a couple years later, when I was on tour with the band that had formed, I was singing in a band called Trial. We were on tour and I started to read The Denial of Death. And I read this book on tour, mostly in the back of the van, sort of laid out like sardines in the back of the van with my bandmates. And I would read with a tiny little, light at night as we were driving across the country and around the United States. And this book blew my mind. And I remember finishing it one morning, 6, 7 in the morning, as the sun was coming up. We were driving through California and everyone had been asleep all night. I had been awake all night, page turning this book, voraciously just reading. And I finished the book as the sun came up. And I thought to myself, holy crap, now what am I going to do with myself? And started writing lyrics based on Becker's ideas. And that was the punk integration. So when Trial stopped playing shows and stopped touring as often years later, I went out on speaking tours and would speak about the lyrics, speak about the ideas in Becker, Viktor Frankl, and also Otto Rank, who I ended up finally reading over years and years and years and getting through the book.
That's fascinating. Greg, how would you, a lot of people have heard about punk rock, but how would you describe what punk rock is? Because people might look at it and just think it's just a bunch of people jumping around in circles, and shouting and roaring. How would you describe what punk rock is?
Well, I always thought punk rock to be a music of passion and a music of energy, a music of ideas, and a music ultimately of, for lack of a better word, of love in a way, rather than hate or rage. I think that punk rock is a music style and an art movement in a way, which lets us express ourselves more freely than we get to on a regular basis. And what I mean by that is, as we go about our days, we don't often get to express our emotions. We don't get to express our passion, our rage, our happiness, our joy. And punk rock gives us that opportunity again and again and again and again and again. And it makes it okay to do that. It's just a rare opportunity, whether in artistic or just general day-to-day life form. So that's why I always loved it. And that's the way I always saw it. And in fact, with all the touring that I did with punk rock and various bands, singing, screaming, as it were, for various bands, I would always tell people, especially with the band I talked about, Trial, earlier, if people interpreted the songs as songs of rage rather than songs of passion or songs written out of a love of and a passion for rather than a rage against, I would always tell them, you missed the point. Like, go back and read them again, read the lyrics again. This is music of energy and vitality and passion and expression, not of restriction and rage and insular reflection. I mean, there's those elements, sure, but it's just an outpouring of experience in musical form.
You can see that in a mosh pit. It looks, to someone who's never been in one and who's not really that au fait, it looks like there's a lot of people fighting. It looks even violent, quote unquote. But when you're in one, it's everyone's fucking going for it, but everyone's minding each other. Someone fucking falls over or trips. People create space, help them back up, give them a pat on the head. Let's go back in. Come on, let's go. It's like there's that. It's like I can't, like, those Greek words spring to mind, like catharsis, ecstasis, communitas. Yes. Like it's a community event that's like group ecstasy. That's this catharsis from the everyday life, this venting of the conformity of the daily mundane getting shedded off. Like it's just this blow out, and at the same time with others in this community ecstasy. It's like it's not what it looks like from the uninitiated.
Yeah, and think about it. I mean, we have a collective agreement right now, the three of us, that we're going to have a conversation. And we're going to do that via an electronic means, okay? And we are going to do that for an hour. And in order to keep that collective agreement going, I agree that the thing that made me mad an hour ago isn't going to filter into our conversation. I'm not all of a sudden just going to push the camera over and scream and run out the door, or whatever it is. And the thing that made Ian excited, he's not all of a sudden going to freak out about that thing and share necessarily. Generally, that's how conversation goes. Well, in punk rock, when I walk out on stage, there was a moment. Let me just shift and tell a moment of a story that I think describes this perfectly. The song that Trial wrote that was most inspired by Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning was a song called When There's Nothing Left to Lose. And it was a song about at the end of at the limit of your personal ability to fathom what's happening in your life, to look inward and know that even if you've been devastated by the world, that you still at least have the choice to survive, right? That's directly out of Viktor Frankl. That's not an original Greg thought. That's Viktor Frankl 100%. You have a choice to continue being, okay? So we wrote this song, and it was about making the choice to be. Well, we were playing in the Netherlands. This is like late 90s or so. We're playing in the Netherlands, and we're on stage and we're playing, and the audience is going just berserk and jumping all over each other and singing along and stage diving and the whole thing, okay? And right before we played When There's Nothing Left to Lose, I looked out at the audience and I explained the point of the song. And I said, we go through our lives so sheltered and so convinced that we have to be a certain way in order for things to maintain their psychological and just general equanimity and balance. I said, what if we made a choice in this moment to let go of all that? And I said, for the next 2 minutes that this song is on, give up the sing-alongs, give up the dancing, give up the dance moves, and give up the way you stand and the way you look and the way you are in the world. And what if for 2 minutes we just gave ourselves the permission to completely let go? What would that room look like? We launched into that song, and it was like an atom bomb went off in the room. And the place went not just berserk, the place was unhinged, okay? And for 2 minutes, it was just unhinged. People were like grabbing each other, grabbing themselves. They didn't even know what to do with themselves. It was like out of control. I've got goosebumps 22 years later thinking of it. Okay, after the show, a woman came up to me, and people were coming up and talking and whatnot. And a woman came up to me and she said, I want to thank you. When you played that one song, I just stood by myself in the back of the room and I screamed as loud as I could, and I was crying. And she and I hugged, and I just will never forget that. Like the permission that one gives oneself to let go when you decide that something else is possible. There it is, right? So that's part of a Viktor Frankl philosophical approach to punk rock. But in essence, that's what inspires me. That's what it's about right there.
That's beautiful, man.
Yeah, I was just listening, going, I got no words for that. That's cool. That's
awesome.
Yeah.
There's a line by Hegel, and he said that art is the sensuous presentation of ideas. Art is the sensuous presentation of ideas, and that's what's springing to mind when you said that, because you took this to think about like a book like Frankl, this lad who 5-6 years in a concentration camp was experienced things that were darker beyond our comprehension. And he wrote about that, even basically in saying that all the good people died, which what does that say about himself? And then you took to take lessons from that and philosophies from that, and then to present them in an artistic manner to a crowd of people that maybe never heard this fella's name before. You know, that's awesome. And then in that kind of a sense, remove the shackles, strip off the conformity, let it go. You know, that's wicked.
Yeah, where do we find our meaning? I mean, do we find our meaning in the parameters we set for ourselves? Yes. Do we find our meaning in the lack of those parameters? Yes. But how often do we get that opportunity, right? Because we engage in these conversations with the perfectly lit background and the fan that I have that you don't see down below that's keeping me nice and cool so that I don't sweat on this incredibly hot day and ruin the illusion that this is a comfortable conversation, right? We keep ourselves so safe and so nice, you know. It's just so ridiculous. Like if I had time before this podcast, I would have written little notes and put them just off to the side of the camera with your names on them and the name of the podcast, so I could casually refer to them and make it all seem even more seamless, right? We live such patterned lives. So when we make the choice to find our meaning without the patterns, then, I mean, it's just a whole new world. I mean, it's a world that's sitting right there, you know, but it's a whole new world just waiting for us. So.
Yeah, you're making my head spin here, Greg, because I've been listening and reading lots on parallel to this about Nietzsche and Kierkegaard at the moment as well. And those sort of thoughts come up from Nietzsche and Kierkegaard about people just living these patterns like just over and over again and not really trying to do, you know, live their full potential or do what's required for them, and to sort of get to the end of their life and then go, oh, what was that about? Like you just not happy, just following in these steps, like walking in these preordained kind of footprints in the ground, you know. And then if you do anything different, then you're nearly ostracized from the group. And we're probably going to start touching on Becker here, but it's that same thing where you put yourself to the side to do something that you're interested in, and the group looks at you and goes, "Why are you doing that? Come back over here. What's going to happen?" Like,
well, you know, we made the joke earlier, you know, that, you know, not being old enough to know of Nirvana, right? Well, realistically, the Nirvana album came out yesterday. I mean, that's like 30 years ago, but it's real quick, right? It's real quick. And it seems like a lifetime. And in essence, it is, but a lifetime's quick. And in the blink of an eye, the three of us are going to be, you know, watching the grass grow from the proverbial dark side of it. You know, we're not going to be here to have this conversation, right? So the thing is, in the spirit of Nietzsche, in the spirit of the, you know, eternal recurrence of existence, like if we could do this all over again, would we spend an hour of our lives having this conversation in this way? I mean, for today, I'd argue, yes, this is pretty fun. I'm pretty into it. You guys seem nice and non-threatening. But, you know, would we set up our lives in this way if we could do it all over again to arrive at this point? Maybe. But, you know, that the question of, well, what's on the other side of that? Maybe. Would we? You know, would we do the same thing again? Would I do punk rock again? Would I, you know, read Otto Rank and spend 20 years trying to get through Art and Artist? Or would I read Becker? Would I buy this shirt? You know, on and on and on.
Yeah.
Would we be living the same life again? Or how could we improve it in a way?
I love that. At one point in Denial of Death, I know Becker quoted Kierkegaard and those ruthless lines that Kierkegaard has, where he talked about the Philistines, the ordinary men who tranquilize themselves with the trivial. And just like they wear the right clothes, they say the right things, they go to the right church, they have the right house, they have the right, everything is all the boxes are ticked, and they just tranquilize themselves with the trivial. And I can't help but thinking that the parallel in that, like there's that essay or the small novella, The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy, where he goes through this whole life where everything is really pleasant and comfortable in his own words. And then it's as the wheels are coming off the wagon right at the end, he realizes what he was after doing, that he was after throwing away everything, his whole this one experience that he had for the sake of conformity and fitting in with the Joneses and meeting these status signaling opportunities and being part of this bourgeois society and being a judge and his authority and all this, and then managed to turn it and have that lovely bit of reclaim, that bit of intimacy with his son right at the end, and realize what's actually important. It's like that reminds me of it quite a lot. And is that as a build on question, just because you'd mentioned it, with Nietzsche, right? Because so in the Denial of Death, I was really curious, and I was really curious at why, because I wonder what your thoughts were on this with Becker, that Becker had Kierkegaard there as the example of the kind of the way to approach the meaning problem from a perspective of the leap of faith into the unknown, or the leap of faith into the beyond, the ineffable. And I wondered how or why, what your thoughts might have been on how he didn't have, because then Freud was kind of almost the contrast that he gave from my kind of reading of it, that Freud was kind of the secular unwillingness to make the leap, keeping the view of this life, short life, very small, narrow, and a kind of secular, atheistic, non-theistic kind of a way of viewing it, whereas Kierkegaard was the contrast. And it was kind of just my reading in the contrast between the two and the use of those two. But I was wondering, first of all, what you thought of that, but then also how or why he didn't, especially because you're writing up this biography of Becker, how or why he didn't maybe use Nietzsche or Heidegger or Camus or some of these other non-theistic, atheistic, existentialist thinkers in his contrast with Kierkegaard, who were also able to explore the problem of meaning and the whole question of the meaning of life, or the meaning in life, or the meaning from life, finding the meaning. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on that area, because it's really fascinating to me and his particular choice of thinkers.
This is a gold medal Olympic level Becker question. So thank you for that. That's a really, really great question. Becker looked at Kierkegaard and saw both. And I think that's where the answer starts. He looked at Kierkegaard and he saw both. Okay, he saw a man deeply rooted in Christianity, deeply rooted in faith, who he also said was the greatest psychoanalyst or greatest psychologist of his time or of the modern era. There's some superlative that Becker applies to Kierkegaard. And I've been trying to say Kierkegaard because my friends in Denmark say, no, not Kierkegaard, you heathen, it's Kierkegaard. But Becker saw in him, in the Kierkegaard guy, saw in him both sides. Becker saw in him the faith, and he also saw the analysis of the human animal, the human experience. So I think that's probably why he didn't choose to turn to some of the others, is because they were too secular. And Becker himself, who comes across oftentimes as if he's atheistic or agnostic, but more atheistic almost. I remember when I was getting into Becker, I always thought he was this champion of atheism because he was so rooted in death and life and these hard, easy to define parameters or opposites. Becker was at times religious when he was younger, but in his Jewish faith, but he was a believer in the mystery, in the great mystery of all this, and that there weren't hard and fast answers. And I think that Marx appealed to him because Marx sort of just established a basis, a foundation from which he could study sociology and examine the inner workings of society from an economic standpoint. But then he always had the counterbalance. He had the counterbalance in Freud, who was studying psychology and trying to figure out the origins of human beings. And this was not as hard as fast as capitalism and its laws and boundaries. Becker always infused a bit of that mystery and a bit of that wonder. And remember that at the end of his career, he's reading Otto Rank. And Otto Rank's Art and Artist, for anyone listening, I know I've mentioned the book twice. If I had my copy in front of me and I opened it up, on the inside cover of every book I read, I write the date when I start reading the book, and then I write notes. Well, typically it'll say Ernest Becker, Denial of Death, and then the date, and then the notes, or maybe the date, and then I started it again later, and then the date again in the notes. My copy of Otto Rank's Art and Artist starts in 1997, 1998, 1999, 2000, 2001, 2002, up until literally a year and a half ago when I finally read the book. I sat down and said, I am reading this damn book finally, because I tried so many times. There you go, Otto Rank's Art and Artist. That's that edition, if you can find it, is the exact same essential, same text, same translation that Becker read as well. Not that cover, but it's the same. Point being, I finally made myself read it. The entire book is rooted in aesthetics. The entire book is rooted in the concepts around creative expansion of the human into the world and the representation of the world in the human. It's very hard to read and incredibly insightful for Becker's work. The point is, there's not a lot of hard parameters throughout the book, the way you'd find in Marx, for example. And Becker was deeply attracted to that. So he's always aiming towards the questioning rather than the hard answers, even though he really wants the hard answers. And if you think about the end of Denial of Death, spoiler alert, everybody, turn this podcast off if you've not read the book and you don't want to hear about the last lines. But the last lines of the book where he says, perhaps the best we can do, and I'm paraphrasing, perhaps the best we can do is fashion something, an object or ourselves, and offer it, so to speak, to the life force. He's talking about engaging in the process of being, this process of just ontology of being, and at the same time of not knowing where that ends up. You know, when we fashion something and we offer it, so to speak, to the life force, when we fashion a life, a belief system, an idea, and we toss it out there, there's no way of knowing where it ends up. He ends that book essentially with a question, right? So this is why I think he turned to Kierkegaard, aside from the fact that he saw him in that duality of being a man of religion and also a man of the mind.
So if we kind of just reverse this up a little bit, because some people will be like, oh, that's a great book, and they're writing down Denial of Death, and they're like, this is great information. I've got to go off now and listen to punk rock and read these books. But in
that order, please.
In that order. If we back it up, Greg, can you tell us a little bit about who actually Ernest Becker was as a person? Because this is quite a profound book for him to write. So what do you think was the kind of the building blocks that led him to that point to write that book?
Okay, how much time do you have?
16 minutes. No.
You just described quite a bit of the biography that I'm working on about Becker's life, at least in question form. So Ernest Becker came from a modest Jewish family and a working class Jewish family. When I say modest, I mean small Jewish family on the East Coast. And he spent his life asking the question of essentially, why do human beings behave the way they do, specifically wondering about the origins of human power and the transference of human power and where our power sources come from. He was really wondering how and why it is that the Nazis could exist, for example. Why is it that we give power to such an institution? Why is there brutality and why is there war? But not just from the perspective of let's end those things, but where's that coming from? Meaning, if we're able to have a conversation, the three of us today, why then do we later end up opposing one another on a battlefield or supporting one another towards a cause on a battlefield?
Yeah.
What's the power source? That's the origin of that. And I don't mean the power source in terms of a God, even though that's an example of a power source, but it's the call to honor. It is the laws. It is the ideology of the country. It is the promise of permanence if we survive the war. All of these elements are places where power resides, and we adhere to them. And we do that individually and we do it collectively. And over the course of his life, Becker was fascinated by that idea. The Denial of Death ultimately is a book less about life and death, even though it's a huge part of the book.
Yeah.
As it is a book about power and transference and where our power resides.
And so, Greg, do you think when you're, from the limited amount I've read about Becker and all about him, he obviously spent a bit of time in the military. Do you think that, or can you talk to the fact of, did that shape his kind of his work post-war, or was it something that was always kind of in his mind since he was a kid, where he always thought about these things, and then he just kind of, in the practice of war, we'll say he kind of thought about it more, or deepened it, or was it something that came out of World War II for him?
Well, Becker's military records have been lost. They burned in a fire in the early 70s. That's confirmed by the military. You're actually hearing it for the first time here, meaning that people have always wondered about his military past. Yeah. But I have the letter from the United States Army confirming that his records were lost in the war. So we don't know exactly where he was and exactly what he was doing. There is a rumor that has circulated for quite a long time about the action that he saw during the war. And those rumors are in question. And the question part of that is pretty easily confirmable, where it's not quite a sure thing that Becker saw action per se during the war. And there's a number of reasons why I say that. The point is, though, it doesn't matter. And the reason it doesn't matter is I've never been in war, okay? And I can only assume that you either have or have not, but you were in the military. But does it matter during wartime if you're on the front lines or not, if the military experience and the war experience is giving you something to think about when, yes, you've already been thinking about these ideas since you were a kid? Becker struggled with the issue of power in his family dynamics. And when he got to the war and went over to Europe, which we know that he did for military service, he saw firsthand that there was indeed a war and people dying, even if he didn't see it firsthand looking down the barrel of a gun. And that really got him thinking about the potential for human evil. And especially as a Jew, and especially given the Holocaust, and especially that this was World War II, this amplified, to answer your question, Becker's appreciation of, that's the wrong word, but his awe at these ideas. And that's really when he started to pursue them full force. Yeah. But what's interesting is that he didn't quite realize what he was pursuing until later in his career. And your question speaks to the book, meaning Denial of Death. Becker started exploring these ideas of power and transference throughout his career and ended up writing about death when a couple things happened. One was that he saw and read Otto Rank's work, which is full of ideas on life and death. And the other is that, quite honestly, it was popular at the time. So he was, Becker as a human wanting to write things of meaning and importance himself. We're not talking about a God king. We're not talking about a transcendent holy man. We're talking about a human being who wanted to matter in the world. He latched on to the death idea because it was important at the time. That's something that I'm writing about in the biography. I mean, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book, was popular at the time. And Becker, I think, saw that as something that was meaningful, that he could, not only earn a living with, but that he actually was interested in. So, and this is stuff that people haven't heard before. You're hearing it here for the first time until you get the biography. But yeah, it's important. And I think it's really important to think about because people associate Becker first and foremost with death and with fear of death. And that was part of it. I mean, in the book, he talks about it, and Escape from Evil, his posthumous follow-up work, he talks about it, that it's tremendously important, as were heroics to him, and the heroics we engage in to sort of transcend in a way. And I know that for first-time people to these ideas, this is going to sound like I've lost my mind, but I mean, to transcend our fear of death, he talked about heroics and its importance. But heroics and death were ideas that he was into in those moments, but they were stepping stones for Becker. They were stepping stones that he was exploring along the way on a ultimately a greater quest to really explore power and where it resides in humans and where we apply it and where we absorb it from.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like you talk about, why Becker speaks about death and why it's fundamental to the book. When I read it, I don't actually get morbid, or I don't kind of focus or fixate on my death or the death process. But what's interesting is that from reading Becker lately and doing these podcasts with Ciaran is my life has started to change in kind of weird ways. An example has been, this is quite funny, last week we had a lot of rain here in Perth, and we don't get a lot of rain, but in the winter we get a few weeks. And I bought a new house last year, and I got a garage, and I've been loving this house the last year and doing things and new to it and the whole lot. And it's really interesting to watch myself because water started coming into the garage last week with the rain. And I started like freaking the fuck out about this happening. And my wife was freaking out. We had a guy over to look at the roof, and there's a big building boom going on here, so things can't get done fast enough. And I was driving back from the coffee shop the other day, and I was like, in 150 years, that house will be leveled. Because I drove by an empty block, like on the street. And I was like, in 150 years, that house will be leveled. And no one will give a fuck about my roof. And I sort of had this moment where I just started laughing in the car going, this is all just fucking bullshit. This is, and I started thinking of like the Stoics, Viktor Frankl, Becker's work, and I was like, this is just, and I came in and I sat down and I had a cup of coffee and I was laughing, and it was like one of the best moments I had in months, because I was just completely like this. I was just, and even thinking about it, it's nearly like I'm watching a comedy show. And I still can't stop laughing about it, because I'm like, this is fucking ridiculous. Like, no one is going to give a shit about my roof in 100 years, you know? I'm better off putting my energy into something more productive if I want to leave any legacy. You know, getting back to Becker's work about this need to like leave this thing. Like, it's just so funny. Like, it makes me laugh so hard still. Like, it's been over a week. It's just like,
I love it. Okay, if you put a pin right there, and that was the end of your podcast series, and you fade to black, the end, and that's what you leave as your legacy. That's exactly, in my opinion, the right approach to take. People ask me all the time, all over the world, what do we do with these ideas? Because they see this as black and white, life and death. That's what I'm talking about, the end. It's a double bind. And that by a double bind, I mean, we are alive and we know it, and it's hard to be alive, and we know we're going to die, and we don't want to die, but without the death, what would we do? Live forever? Then what do we do? So in the face of death, what do we do as a living creature? I could go on with this entangled situation that we're in. It's a double bind, right? And that's what you found yourself in. It was critically important for you to make sure that this roof didn't leak, and ultimately you knew that 150 years from now, somebody else was going to be standing on what's left of that house, and maybe they're going to find your shirt or a watch or something, and they're going to be like, some idiot lived here, and they're going to throw that last piece of you in the trash and build their own house. Okay. And while we're on the subject, our conversation doesn't matter. What I'm saying right now doesn't matter. This is all useless. 100,000 years from now, 1,000 years, people aren't going to have the technology to look at or interpret this archaic thing we're recording here, nor will they even care. They will probably advance to telepathy by that point. This is meaningless, okay? But what do we do in the face of that double bind? And I'd honestly say we laugh. That's the response. I've had conversations with my friend John Wilson, who is the man who handed me those 3 books originally about this. In the face of the double bind, we engage it with laughter. That's what we can do. And if we can find that space, we're in way better shape than if we're trying to figure out the answers. No offense to the philosophers and the Stoics, and on and on. And on. So your laughter just then is what I'm going to remember long after I forget, that I was striving for meaning in the things I was saying in this conversation.
Yeah, it's funny. Like sometimes when you think about things like that, like so that's one example. And another extreme example would be, which I remembered as well, reading Becker's work talking about military stuff. In 1998, I was in South Lebanon, and we were like, and we went for this process of like nearly every morning, the Hezbollah in Lebanon would attack the Israelis. And we were in the middle, so we would get like, mortars or fired at. So we had to go into the bunker. And I remember like one morning we were in the bunker, and like mortars were hitting very close. So the whole like bunker was like shaking, and this was going on. And instead of people like crying and like, we're carrying on, we all just started laughing. And we went into this hysterics of laughing. And I remember like just being bent in two with a cigarette, laughing. I was about 19. And we were all just laughing. And it got to that point where we were just kind of so sick of it happening over and over again, like every morning getting woken up at 5:30 to go into this bunker. And we just all started laughing. So it's really interesting, like when you're faced, when you start thinking about, like that's an imminent death, this could be there, or you start thinking about in 150 years, it's interesting. I can't stop doing it even now. I'm not trying to put it on. I just started laughing because I think, I'm not sure why. I just think this is all, it's actually funny when you step back about it. And then it makes me think about why people argue so much, and today's world is actually brilliant because, you said earlier on, Greg, about why did the Nazis do what they've done. I remember so I was born like in the late 70s. And I remember like learning history in the 80s and 90s and reading about stuff. And I've read a lot of World War II history, like his name escapes me now. The guy that's written loads of books, Anthony Beevor, BWVR, the English guy. And you read those books and you think, how in the name of God did this ever happen? And then you see coronavirus and you think, oh, this is actually how it happened. This is just like the same thing. You know, you look at Trump in America and you see, and look, whether you agree or disagree, it doesn't matter. It's the same kind of building blocks building up along the way. And you kind of go, this is unbelievable. Like this is how these things happen. And again, that makes me laugh as well, because I think, what is the point of all this arguing over nothing and arguing on Facebook? Like and social media, and you just kind of go, this is all just a load of shit sometimes. Like, what is the point of this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and none of this is to say that people who have bombs raining down on them at this moment, say in Palestine, or who are really getting the shit kicked out of them wherever they happen to be anywhere in the world, that they should just simply laugh as the bombs fall. But if we choose to engage with the why and the understanding and what does it mean, and the trying to figure it out, and the you know, the conversations and mental gymnastics which come along with the privilege of having the time to sit here and talk and think about these ideas, at the end of the conversation, I hope that we're laughing about it. But you bring up a really, really, really amazing situation where, in the face of actual death, you just started laughing about it because you realized, like, is there really meaning behind this? I mean, or is there no meaning behind this? That's fascinating. That's fascinating to me.
And you're powerless as well in that situation. People have this idea that they control so many things in their life. Like, you know, a guy was asking me yesterday how I ended up doing what I was doing, and he was looking at me as if, like, how did you go on that path, like, after dropping out of school? Like, and I was like, well, I've no idea. It's like, some things just happen. You can get into that whole kind of thing about free will and no for it, and not having free will. Is it all like predetermined? But yeah, you definitely, there's a lot of situations you don't have any control in. Like, I don't know if I told this story, Ciaran. Here's another one. I'm going to hand over to Ciaran for some questions. I'm just going to tell jokes and stories today. But anyway, a few weeks ago, Greg, you've been here to Perth. I don't know if you managed to go down to the Cottesloe beach when you were here.
I went to a couple beaches, both of which were brilliant, but I don't remember specifically which one.
Yeah, so you probably went down to Cottesloe. A lot of people go to Cottesloe that are tourists, and it's sort of the beach where it's probably the easiest to swim. But anyway, as you know, here in Western Australia, it's known for sharks. And so I swam to an island off the coast here last year. It's like 20 k's away. And I swam that and was like, fine. Didn't feel anything, right? But then, as in, well, not fine, as in I wasn't afraid of sharks or anything or whatever. I thought because the boat was there and the canoe was there, I was all protected, right? So I had that kind of thing in my mind. No, nothing's going to get me because there's a boat and a canoe there. I'm okay, right?
There's a great white gives a fuck about a canoe, like,
exactly. You know? And I was thinking, oh, they'll see it coming in, as if like the shark wouldn't like come from underneath you and fucking jack you, right?
Yeah, the shark is like, no, there's a canoe there. No, I can't go near that fella. Like,
but that's the stories you tell yourself, you see, so you don't, like, you know, go into the hole. But a few weeks ago, Greg, we were down swimming from North Cottesloe to Cottesloe, which is a 1 kilometer stretch. And so we generally will swim down and swim back, 2K swim, right? And so we're swimming down, it's like a Sunday morning. The water's a little bit murky and we swim over this reef. We get down to the wall, we turn around and we go back, and there's 5 of us. So I somehow get separated from the group. And this is like in Becker's work, like, you know, going to the group. The group then separates. There's 2 over here. There's 2 sort of behind me. And I've sort of drifted in towards the shore. And I think, oh, well, you know, it's all right because I'm kind of close to the shore. And I'm swimming along and it's a bit murky. I'm in about maybe 10 feet of water. And all of a sudden I see this big fucking tail fin and a fin like that underneath me going like this. So I'm like, what the fuck? Like a big shape, and it's about maybe 6 to 7 feet, and it just comes right underneath me. And I'm like, fuck that. So I turn left and I swim to the shore. I get out of the water, and there's an older guy sort of playing around the water. I said, listen, mate, I don't know what the fuck is out there. I said, but it's big and it's grey and it's dark. I said, and went swam right underneath me. And he goes, oh shit. He said, I saw a shark here last week, and he runs out. So we're standing on the shore. And next minute, I see my friends, the 2 up here, the 2 behind. And there's a pod of dolphins swimming with them. But there's one of the other dolphins came off and sort of was swimming underneath me and went back out. And it was interesting that a couple of things. One is that your instant reaction is like, I'm fucked here. I'm going to get jacked by some sort of shark. 2 is, you know, you look after yourself. And 3, then the whole experience was like, oh, fuck, I should have been out there with my friends and playing with dolphins. Because they came back in and were like, that was the most amazing experience. I swam under, I saw a little baby dolphin. I was like, I was shitting my pants. I thought it was a shark, like completely opposite, right? And because they were in clearer water. So I jumped back in and swam as well. But it's really interesting. Like the same thing can have different outputs, but also as well, you know, it's different how you react in the face of those things, like the military example, but the shark thing. But then when I got out, I was like, what could I have done anyway? Like, it's not like if if that shark, if it was a shark, it was going to get you, but it was a dolphin. And people were like, didn't you know it was a dolphin? You can tell by the tail fin. I'm like, dudes, I am not there pulling out an encyclopedia, looking at pictures and trying to figure out whether this is a shark or a dolphin. I'm getting the fuck out of it's big and it's great. So yeah, it's really interesting when you get confronted with these different things, how you react. Or the other one is classic one is in traffic, when someone like cuts you off, death is imminent, but you don't really laugh then, you get mad. So it's interesting when you're faced with some things, how you react. So it's not always laughter. Sometimes it's fear and you run away. And other times then it's anger and you want to push into it. So it's interesting on the different situations too, when you are confronted with it, how you do react. And I find it interesting to watch myself do that as well.
Well, in the spirit of this conversation and things that we've talked about, next week when you go back out swimming and the gray presence swims beneath you and you stay in the water to play with the dolphin, but you end up getting eaten by a shark. When we do the follow-up podcast, we'll just laugh about it. Okay, we'll a blank square where your face is in the image, and the two of us will just be laughing about it in the spirit of just laughing in the face of death.
Yeah, he died with an encyclopedia looking at pictures. What was that?
So we need to get you an underwater encyclopedia, something you can read underwater and say, excuse me, hold on 1 second, swimming being. Are you in fact dangerous? Let me turn to page 336 and determine what you are. Yeah,
I swam on Friday. It was even worse. Couldn't see more things. And I was like, I had a wetsuit on, so I was safer than Ciaran. The shark won't bite you in a wetsuit.
Like wetsuits either. Like it's like Batman with his shark spray. Remember that old Batman clip with the head hanging out of a helicopter spraying the shark?
This is great.
I actually had a similar thing happen to me where I was years ago and I was hungover after drinking most of a bottle of tequila the night before, and the next morning I went in to just kind of swim off the hangover, and then I didn't know that there was a fucking big dolphin on this beach, and I was just hungover, still kind of drunk, and I was just swimming up and down, just like sweating out demons basically up and down this beach, and this fucking thing swims underneath me. I didn't know that there was a dolphin on the beach. The dolphin ended up being called Dusty. It was this really friendly local dolphin that just lives in this cove in Ireland and West Coast, and I just remember like gargling in the water, like screaming, face under the water, screaming, and it's like a what, bubbling and fucking gargling. No idea. I didn't even know there was fucking dolphins. I thought there was one dolphin called Fungi off the coast of Kerry. I didn't know there was a fucking dolphin. There's this other. I didn't know. But,
I love that the stories are getting more and more towards like completely benign interactions with creatures, like now that have names and addresses and birthdays and friends. You know? Next it's going to be, I was sitting in my living room and this gray shape was next to me, and I turned to it. It was the dolphin who's been my roommate for 3 years, and oh my god, I freaked out and spilled my beer. You guys are out of control.
I know. At least my dolphin didn't have a name.
On a lighter note and totally unrelated, I'd like to chat about Nazis because
okay.
That must be the greatest segue in history, from dolphins to Nazis.
I thought for sure you were going to bring up something about death, but you raised the only thing that's worse than death, which is Nazis.
Oh, Christ. No. Oh, fuck me. Oh, Christ.
That's probably the biggest laugh that the Nazis have gotten in the last 70 years. So that's pretty good. Good work.
Oh, man, fucking this is brilliant. You know, I had to get up at 5:30 in the morning to do this. This is a good start to the day, lads. You've made it worthwhile. I tell you that. That's going to be, if we ever write a book, it's going to be called From Dolphins to Nazis.
That'd be it. It'd be like the Make Sam Harris's Making Sense podcast, except it'll be that. But and there's actually a funny, like, we're speaking of the laughing one. So I've got a number of, like, on my writing desk here, on my desk where I work. There's a few objects I have around that are kind of like basically reminders. One of them, speaking of laughing, is actually I have a big fat laughing Buddha hanging off on the desk and the table that I get a kick off. Again, it's just a kind of reminder of the absurd. And then the other one is a gift I was given when I was living in America in 2016. I was actually given it by a mate who had gotten it as a tip for a job. And it's a knife from World War II. But as you can see, it's a Nazi military issue knife. And even the blade is stamped 1940, like it's a Nazi military issue job. Like, and that's basically a reminder, because the things that I'm really, really interested in, and which is why I kind of took to Becker like a duck to water, was, and then initially terror management theory, for anyone who isn't familiar with it, basically the research scholarship done off the back of Becker's philosophical underpinnings and philosophical propositions based on this combination of all this work stitching together and these new insights based on Otto Rank and everything. But you mentioned earlier on, Greg, the concept of, in relation to power and Becker's interest in power, you kind of briefly touched on, or you mentioned the word transference. So this idea of, because what fascinates me is, again, it's like I'm absolutely, like World War II, of course, is like the archetypal shit show in human history, where you have these ideological extremisms at all these different, in these two different major flavors, of course, with Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. But then obviously we have a conflicting with the liberal, democratic, open society of the Western world as well. All of this taking place. You have these ideological extremisms, and then versus the liberal, open, democratic Western society. So I was just curious if I'd love for you, because I think for me, this idea of transference and the concept of essentially our tendency toward submission to ideological affiliation as a result of potential death anxiety is one of the most important and interesting components of Becker's philosophy, that then with terror management theory went on to provide hundreds of studies to support, like 1,000 odd studies in terror management theory. I'm not sure how many of them are based around ideological affiliation, but this idea of the whole point that we buffer our death anxiety as a result of convincing ourselves that we are a meaningful part of we are a valuable part of a world that is meaningful, and the world that is meaningful bit being the cultural worldview. So I would love if you could articulate or just explain this concept of transference, because in trying to understand how Nazi Germany happened, how ideological mass movements of any form happen, there's something there to Becker, and then that has loads of evidence piled onto it by TMT, that I think is legitimately invaluable to understand if our species is actually to continue and keep the show on the road and not self-extinguish as a result of nuclear annihilation. Pick your existential catastrophe. Like, there's too many of them to list, unfortunately, since 1945, when we step into this era where we develop the technological capacity to end the whole show. So I'd really love for you to give your thoughts on transference and ideology and the role of death anxiety in ideology, because this is one of the things that I think could actually keep humanity around longer than we might. We're basically just keep the show on the road. So I'm rambling a bit, but
no, you're not rambling. I mean, and the answer to your question would take hours probably, but the bare bones of it, I think, are about this psychological effect of belonging. I mean, and it doesn't have to be about the Nazis, right? The Nazis provided for the people at the time a sense of belonging to something greater than themselves. So the idea, if we're looking through a Beckerian lens, was that the individual knows on some level that it's going to die. And I'm speaking in simplistic terms, right? We know that we're going to die. All of a sudden, along comes this concept, this group, this ideology, which promises 1,000-year Reich. We're going to live forever, essentially. This is going to outlast anything that currently exists. We're going to destroy all these different people, and we are going to survive as a result. It's going to last for 1,000 years. Psychologically, through a Beckerian lens, the individual, consciously and or subconsciously, has a response thinking, wow, I've got maybe 40 years left if I'm lucky, but this thing's 1,000 years. So if I'm a part of that, even when Greg is hanging out as a distant memory, long gone, with the ghost of Ian in the remnants of his garage 150 years from now, still have 850 years left of this Reich to carry on in our honor and in our memory and with our vitality if we're a part of that. Now that just sounded like I gave a promo campaign basically for why one should join Nazism. But it's not about the Nazis. It's about any group. Any group satisfies that need, that psychological urge to belong, to be a part of something greater than ourselves. And the first thought I had was I was going to mention religion does the same thing. You know, I don't necessarily want to pair the Nazis and the Christians or the Nazis and the Jews or the Nazis and whomever, but essentially it's the same function for the human animal. I'd suggest, and this isn't me, Greg the genius, this is me just parroting Becker essentially, that the three of us does the same thing, right? Psychologically, on some level, for Greg, who might get hit by a bus in 45 minutes, it makes me feel really happy to know that I've got these two new friends in this group of three. It's going to be part of a series, which is going to be a podcast, and maybe it's going to be famous in Ireland, Australia, Seattle, and maybe, you know, some other city, town, or country as well. And if I get hit by that bus, this is going to outlast me. There's something about the belonging to this which is meaningful. And again, it's what the Nazis represented. They represented a place where we could put our power, that is the transference dynamic, where we could apply the power that normally would be elsewhere into something new and something lasting. And it seemed at the time, for those involved, like it provided for them that sense of mattering in a meaningful world. The Nazis had ordered the world in a certain way that the meaning was very tangible. Join us, and this is the way that it's going to work. But this is true for any organized group, ultimately. It's the same psychodynamic situation. And, you know, I know that people are going to watch this and get enraged when I make parallels between Nazis and religious groups and podcast groups. Functionally, it's the same psychodynamic situation. So that's my initial hit, you know, as an answer for that question. But I think really that's where it resides. The Nazis made a promise, and the promise was implicit that join us and you will live for 1,000 years. Well, that sounds great if you're limited to 100 at best.
What about like, I don't know if this is the right terminology, I would call it reverse transference. So for example, in the time, if you were living in Germany in 1939, you kind of bought into that idea, or a few years ago, maybe, you know, you were in America and bought into the Trump thing or whatever. What about like what I've been kind of reading Becker, I think about reverse transference, where people still identify with that of yesteryear. For example, Dan Carlin, the historian, hardcore history, if you ever listen to him, he talks about the importance of time. Why is Genghis Khan, you know, like, oh, he was such a great leader. He was such this, he was such that. Same with some of the Roman Empire leaders. But, you know, arguably Genghis Khan killed more people than Hitler did, and he's celebrating. Why is, and he was, Dan Carlin talks about time. And then I started thinking about the context of myself, being a person living in another country. I've got tattoos on my arm here, which are very like, you know, Viking and Celtic orientated. And I thought, oh, is that like a reverse transference where I identify being a Celt and coming from a Viking stock that, even though it came in and, you know, went crazy in Ireland like an invading species, but I wouldn't have an English tattoo because the English were in Ireland for 800 years, but somehow we seem to like the fact of the Viking crazy past. So, and that's because that was a few hundred years before the English came in. So do people reverse this transference and identify with stuff from the past to like say they were part of something that was big or part of something else to give them that meaning as well?
I think it's the same experience. I think it's the same transference. And I mean, you know, we could sit here all day and apply transference to just about anything we're talking about. But the question, going back to the question that we were just talking about is, you know, you started by saying this has hope for bettering us or keeping us from killing each other, right? I think that's the important thing behind, I don't want to say thing, I think that's the important mechanism of thought behind what we can do with Becker's ideas. We're going to fall into a trap if we see Becker as another God king, if we see Becker as the greatest philosopher, if we see him as the greatest this or the greatest that, if we read his books as if they were the Bible, we're just going to fall into a deadly trap. And quite honestly, I'd advise not doing that. What I would advise doing is continually asking, okay, If I, as this fragile, insecure human creature, being in the world filled with fear of the unknown, have a tendency to adhere or to latch onto promises, implicit or explicit, of permanence, of power, of authority, well, then what do I do when those situations arise? And do I have the wherewithal to recognize when they do? Trump's language, for example, and you said you don't know if you're, for or against or whatnot. I'm very, very against, right? So when Trump's language was psychologically designed to entreat, to invite, include, to suck in, to hypnotize, to spellbind people to join him. And it was crafted for him, by him, with him, what have you, but it was specifically designed to take insecure, frightened creatures who are what we are, and have us be sucked into that next, dare I say, Reich that he was going to offer, that was going to last another 4, another 16, or as that video that he sent around, another 100 years of his reign, essentially, like that. And I know I'm sounding like I'm flipping out and going off on conspiracy theory angles about Trump, but let's take for a minute that we're not. Let's take for a minute what he said. And basically what he was saying was, join me. We've got something greater going on than those heathens do, basically, which is what the Nazis were doing. They talked about the Jews as animals. They equated them to rats. And by doing that, debased them so that we saw them as less than, and it became very easy to kill or exterminate them. Well, Trump was essentially doing the same thing. Join us and we can work against those differing others. And, the question then becomes, does the human insecure creature have the wherewithal to go, hold on one second, and second guess or question, essentially, while still being that insecure creature? That's Becker's point at the end of the denial of death. We don't get to change that. We don't reach a point where all of a sudden we're illuminated and there's an aura, and all of a sudden we've transcended the human experience and we all float around Buddha-like. Not what happens.
Yeah.
What does happen is that we're in it. Well, while we're in it, what are we going to do with this new dawning awareness of what power does to and for us, and the way we adhere to the promises of its offer?
Do you classify Becker, and this is interesting, this is a question for you as well, Ciaran. Do you classify Becker as an anthropologist, a philosopher, a psychologist, a general writer? Because for me, I think in some ways he's just like reviewing what's there at the time. And he's talking about what could be. So in some ways, I don't view him through any of those lenses. I think he's nearly like an independent scientific reviewer of the data in some ways, because it is a bit like he does pull on different areas. So what's your thoughts, and how would you categorize him?
It's funny that you say that. I literally wrote that chapter of the book over the last week, where I
really?
talked about, yeah, absolutely, where I talked about Becker as, what was he? Because the thing is, he drew from anthropology, he drew from theology, he drew from sociology. He drew from philosophy. He drew from ontology. Yeah. I could go on and on and on and on and on. And then we could talk about each of the people that he drew from in each of those realms and what they signified to him. Becker he refused to be, not just that he refused to be limited by discipline. At the time that Becker was doing his work, people were single disciplinary. If you were an anthropologist, you worked within the confines of anthropology. Yeah. If you were a sociologist, you worked within the confines of sociology. You certainly didn't do what Ernest Becker did, which, is to be trained in anthropology and all of a sudden look to Rousseau for philosophy, but think, wait a minute, Heidegger's over here talking about being, so I'm going to draw from that, and then I'm going to draw from this other German philosopher over here, and I'm going to draw from the sociologist here. No one was doing that at the time. Becker was decades ahead of his time in that regard. So Becker was an interdisciplinary thinker, and he most definitely resided well in that realm. And anyone who worked with him at the time says the same, or said the same, because many of them are passing on now, said the same thing, which is that he just didn't play by the rules academically. And he suffered for that his entire career. Because nowadays it makes perfect sense, right, to draw from different sources. But back then you certainly did not. You stayed in your lane, what people were calling 10 years ago in a very popular sense in the United States, amidst your silo. Right? right? That's, people were trying to break out of silos in the corporate world. Well, that was in response to that concept 40 years ago. Becker was just ahead of the game in that regard. He just didn't want to be bound. He saw value and saw potential puzzle pieces to this puzzle that he was putting together from all of those different disciplines.
I love that. And that's this is an area that I wanted to ask you about, was because Becker had this kind of a phrase that might be useful as kind of what seems to be, and so I suppose if I bring it back, you paraphrased the very end of the denial of death earlier on, where he talked about fashioning something, an object or ourselves, and tossing it into the confusion, a contribution, so to say, to the life force, or whatever way he put it. Well, the life force, the way that he seemed to use it, it's in a way that's almost like a kind of an agnostic Gnosticism, in that it's there's something here that's worth keeping going. I don't know what it is. I can't put words on it. And then it reminds me of like the very beginning of the Tao Te Ching. The very first thing it says in a book full of words is the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. And then it goes on to give you 100 pages of fucking words talking about the thing that can't be talked about. So then, there's this, it's like Becker's had this beautiful, his prose were beautiful, and his use of language, but there was that kind of, I can't help but think of it as an agnostic Gnosticism and an awareness of something that could be, to use religious language, that he might have construed as the divine or the sacred, that he didn't want to almost tarnish with a specific set of dogmas or a specific set of there we go, the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao, or a specific set of religious structures, but there's a lot of the way that kind of thinking, to me, is much less Western or Middle Eastern and much more kind of Buddhist, Taoist. But then there's no mention. There's like in the denial of death, it's like Buddhism or Hinduism is mentioned once, I think, at one point. When I went back and looked in the index, I didn't remember reading about it, and it's mentioned at page 12 or whatever, or 22, very early on. There's a brief touch, and then it's not touched on. But that concept of a contribution to an ineffable divine, or a feeling a part of, like, this contribution to the life force, like this, there's something about that that's very Eastern. But the rest of anything I've read by him doesn't seem to be at least quoted or referenced as in terms of an Eastern philosophical take, with Taoism or Buddhism, to use examples. So Buddhism in particular, it just strikes me. So this concept of the life force. So I was wondering, I just have to throw a load of information at you, but I suppose it would be for two questions would come out of that. One is, what do you have any inclinations or any thoughts on what he meant by the life force? And secondly, what's the crack with access or his awareness of Eastern philosophy? Because I'm also aware that we're 50 years afterwards. We've had countless hours of Alan Watts videos that we've got a chance to listen to, and exposure from the East. And I know it would have only been in the 50s, 60s that Eastern philosophy would have been seeping into Western, the intelligentsia and everything. So it would have been, so I was just curious, those two questions. What is the life force, in your opinion, that he was describing, or what was he trying to impart? And secondly, was there any exposures to Eastern philosophy that he had, or that he was influenced, or that he, or not so?
Well, you nailed it with your Gnostic, agnostic, and not wanting to pinpoint anything specific in the use of the term life force. The way you just described that, I think, is spot on. I think he didn't want to end the book by saying, and offer it, so to speak, to Jesus Christ, and offer it, so to speak, to Muhammad, and offer it, so to speak, to the Buddha. He just didn't want to do that. It wasn't the right approach, because he was talking about something more general. What's interesting is that the term life force comes up repeatedly in Becker's work. We think of it only as the last two words of the denial of death, but it appears repeatedly throughout his written canon. It's there again and again and again. And it seems to have different nuance as he uses it again and again and again. And there's sometimes where it seems that he's talking about the creative force. Sometimes it seems he's talking about the spiritual presence. Sometimes it seems he's talking about the generalized agnostic, as you described it, just ethereal question mark at the end of our existence. It comes up a number of times. So I think that you nailed it when you talked about that the way you did. Becker definitely had influence from the East. Becker studied under a guy named Douglas Herring at Syracuse University. Herring was an anthropologist, and Becker's PhD dissertation, which became his first published book, was Zen: A Rational Critique.
No way.
Yeah.
Really?
Becker looked in his dissertation, which then became Zen: A Rational Critique, at Zen and how transference between the Zen master and the Zen student could be paralleled between the patient in a psychotherapeutic situation in the United States and psychiatric situation in the United States. And he compared and contrast, which is valid. Is there power lost in one situation? Is there power gained in the other? Is one less valid because of the modes of evident in the relationship between the Zen master and the Zen student, for example? But yeah, he was very cognizant of the East and very early on. And this is an example of Becker being a trendsetter. And without any doubt, I mean, this is something that I'm writing about for sure, that Becker was ahead of his time in a number of different areas. And since we brought it up, this is one of them. I mean, Becker was a trendsetter, or let's take that word out, not a trend setter. Becker had awareness of and interested in something that became a trend, because most certainly Zen did. And you talked about Alan Watts and the way that exploded in the 60s. I mean, Becker was doing this work well before that. I mean, the dissertation was done around 1960. I think the book was published right around the same time. So this preceded the explosion of Zen in the West, but most definitely he was aware of these ideas.
So he wasn't involved with that whole kind of movement that was happening at the time, was he? Or in influenced by it, when you had like Richard Albert Ramdas and you had Timothy Leary and all these guys. He wasn't hanging around with any of those guys.
No, he couldn't have been bothered, I don't think. He was on a different path. To be totally honest, I mean, and I don't mean to speak, Ernest, wherever you might be or not. I don't mean to speak on your behalf, but I am. He couldn't have been bothered. And what I mean by that is that they were on a very specific path that would have been seen in Becker's eyes as excellent, interesting, and too limited to really deal with the problems we're facing culturally and personally and psychologically. They were going after one thing, and Becker, I think, was going after a bigger picture.
That's with Becker, like this description that you have, and his ability to have this foresight, or this ability to be so ahead of the game, and he's aware, like to have put together this body of work, and particularly the denial of death, and to be able to nail down these insights that then were to go on to have 1,000 studies to actually provide evidence to support down the line, it's that in itself. Even if you knew nothing else about a guy, there's this fella who wrote a book, who managed to propose a load of ideas and stitch together cross-disciplinary ideas, connecting dots across all sorts of disciplines from all sorts of philosophers and thinkers and different disciplines of psychology, philosophy, psychology, sociology, everything, and then to present ideas that would go on to have hundreds and who knows how many more studies confirming is unbelievable. And then, but I think that multidisciplinary, there's a line I really like from this mathematical physicist who's kind of a bit of a polymath kind of character as well. Is Eric Weinstein, I don't know how to pronounce his second name, who's like, he's at the moment he works in business. He's like the managing director of Teal Capital, but he's also this really interesting character. I've listened to loads of podcasts and everything, but he has this line. He said that a jack of all trades is a master of none, but a master of one trade is a connector of none. And that's what Becker reminds me of, is that he was just that maybe his ability to see this vast swath of human culture, human society, multidisciplinary expertise, to then be able to see the common threads and stitch together this kind of really interesting kind of patchwork quilt to illustrate human society. This is what human condition is. Deal with it. It's fascinating.
So let me bring up an important point that I want to bring up about Becker the man amidst all this. It would be very easy to cue the music right now, end the episode. We've just celebrated how masterful, insightful, and Nostradamus-like Becker was. which in some ways, some of the things he wrote about, some of the things he talked about were quite remarkable, and end with everyone listening going, wow, in the same way they go, wow, when they think about Kierkegaard, they think about Nietzsche, or they think about some of the other great writers in history, that I will never be that, because I'm just some idiot standing in front of a brick background, and you're just a couple guys who almost get eaten by sharks. We're never gonna be that which Becker was. So I wanna normalize something. All of the things you said, in my opinion, yes, are true insofar Becker did these incredible things. It was almost like he was writing about things, not realizing how popular they might become someday when other people caught on, or he wrote about this and it was very insightful and it led to this and whatnot. And he was questioning himself all the while. And the reason I say that is so that what we don't do in this call, and that what we don't do when we read about Becker's work, is create a cult of personality around him, and we don't elevate him and diminish ourselves in the midst of that, because that is antithetical to what he was about as a person and as a scholar. And while most definitely there were times where he wanted to become more known and others were becoming more known and he was not, and he was frustrated, and that quest for mattering sort of took over at times, the way it does for all of us. You want your podcast to have 1 million listeners. You might say you don't, but you do. If tomorrow there's 1 million listeners, you're going to feel great about it, right? You're just going to feel great about it. Questioning himself all the while. The entire time he's doing these incredible academic things and drawing on all of these different influences. And I'm telling you firsthand that I've seen the work, meaning I've held his note cards in my hands, the thousands of extant note cards that he typed out where he's drawing an idea from over here and applying it to something he literally read years before, because I'm reading the note cards and I'm thinking, oh my God, that which comes from this book references the thing that I know he read 4 years before, that he's just casually going, oh yeah, and he's making these connections like a computer, questioning himself all the while. And I offer that as a gift to us and to your listeners especially, so that as we delve into these ideas of major thinkers, that we don't undermine ourselves amidst that. I think that's really important to keep in mind.
Beautiful, man.
And I suppose as you're going through and you're finding out about Ernest Becker, and in the world where we love gossip and the Kardashians, what's surprising that you found out about Becker that people didn't know about? Is there any nuggets you can give us without giving away too much in the book? Is there something that stood out to you, like, wow, I never knew that about Becker? What he like to do, I don't know, pole dancing or cartwheels or something, I don't know. Was there anything crazy that we never knew about?
Well, the one that I just suggested is in fact one. The fact that he all the while was questioning himself. I mean, when I read Becker's book, I did what a lot of people do, is they went, oh my gosh, this Ernest Becker guy, I can't even believe it. I'm going to devote my life to studying these ideas, as if I just, met and shook hands with Buddha or something. But Becker, Becker had the same insecurities that we all deal with, certainly. So that's one. But second, and this is of interest, is that Becker played classical guitar. And I bring that up not as just here's a wacky tidbit about Becker. Hey, he was a coin collector or something like that. But it's because his exploration of classical guitar was in itself masterful as well. He devoted himself to it with an unabashed intensity. And I spoke at one point to the man who taught Becker to play guitar, a classical guitarist. And he said he was amazed that Becker was as good as he was and as devoted a student as he was. And what's fascinating about that is it ties directly into the side of the conversation we had earlier, where we talked about Kierkegaard and why it is that Becker latched on to that sort of faith-based system of thinking, I guess you'd say, or faith-based the ideas that Kierkegaard put forward that were faith-based, the mystery of it all. Well, that's what artistic process is. When you pick up a guitar for the first time, it's a board. It's got 6 strings strung across it. You're supposed to play it with one hand and do something with the other hand. And what the hell am I going to do with this thing? And you have 2 options at that point. You either say, nope, I'm going to go back to eating pizza and do something different. Or you go, I have no idea. And you start playing around with it. And you don't play anything at first. You're not Eric Clapton on day one. you're Greg fumbling around with the guitar on day 1, and day 5, you're still questioning, but maybe you've learned a couple things. On day 500, you've maybe learned to play a bunch of songs and you're playing well, and you're still learning. And day 5,000, 10,000 days into it, you're still learning, still questioning, still in the midst of that mystery, the mysterious sort of process, that mystery that is inherent in our artistic process. So when I learned about Becker and his playing the guitar, I was pretty fascinated by what it illuminated about the man and what he valued. He wasn't necessarily valuing answers. He was valuing questions. And learning something artistic and delving into artistic process is constant questioning. The major one being, do you stay in the artistic process and see where the ebbs and flows of it end up, or do you quit and give up because it isn't easily defined? So
that's actually great, because so many people like go, will say about going back to university to do like a master's or a PhD, or they'll say, oh no, I did uni like 30 years ago. I couldn't be bothered doing that anymore, and they're in a job. I'm like, how can you just sit there and not learn? How can you not just, and I'm not talking about going through some formal learning, but constantly being inquisitive. It's like my dad was here a few years ago for the first time, and he was going, oh, you're in your 40s now. When are you going to calm down and relax? I'm like, never. And he just looked at me, and I said, all my childhood, issues are now my adult attributes. Can't sit still, constantly doing many things, too much energy, can't focus on one thing, wants to know everything about everything, and can't sit down and for 2 minutes. I'm like, yeah. And that's what got me to the dance, and it's what's going to keep me here, because it's all of those things that I just find fascinating, that constant jumping across multiple disciplines, and that's evident from my career and what I've studied and these type of conversations we have. I think that's where the richness comes out. And I'm not talking about richness in terms of like getting a good job or winning a contract. I'm talking about richness in your life. Like if you can be, sort of up here good, it doesn't matter whether I can't remember who said it. I think it was one of the Stoics, like about, basically once you have it in your mind, you're fine. And I find out with coronavirus, with the lockdowns, people freaking out. I'm like, my world is reduced. If I can exercise and get coffee and internet connection, lock me up for a couple of years. I don't really care, and it's sort of over my life as I've got older and explored more things. It's like the less things I truly need to be happy. And so coffee, internet, and exercise are the 3 things. My wife said the same thing, so we probably don't even need each other. She's probably alluding to there. So,
well, it's true. I mean, we talked about this in a sense. We talked about it before. Like, what are we doing at times? I mean, the Instagram followers and the social media and the striving for this and striving for that. These are, in a way, empty pursuits. I mean, all of it. We could look at it as it's all empty. Yeah. But I think that, really asking ourselves what matters most is incredibly important. I mean, it's incredibly important. What matters most, given the limited time we have, and what are we willing to sacrifice to get that thing? And I mean, it's hard sometimes. I definitely, my mind is the same way. It's a damn miracle that I stand in front of this camera for an hour and talk to you and focus without my brain going 700 different directions. I had a therapist once tell me, after diagnosing me as having ADHD and me freaking out, like, oh my gosh, what am I gonna do? Do I take medication for it? Do I, blah, 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 blah. And she said, this is a superpower. Just take it as a superpower. And whether or not that's true, I think it is. But she said, take it as a superpower. And as an aside, it's funny. I hung up that call and I called one of my best friends, and I thought, oh my gosh, I got to talk to somebody about this. And I called my friend Brandon, and I got him on the phone. I was like, Brandon, you're not going to believe this. I just got off the phone with this therapist, and she said that I have ADHD and blah 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 blah. And he said, wait, you mean you're just now realizing this? Like, we've all known this all along. So, refining our lives a bit isn't a terrible thing. And we're talking about that in the midst of talking about interdisciplinary thinking and wide-ranging thinking. So, there's a balance. There's a balance between the two to be found.
So that's a nice segue into kind of our closing paragraph of this conversation today, which is about how do you focus, Greg, for the writing process? Because there is lots of ideas everywhere. There's lots of stuff about Becker, the context of today. Like we've gone off on all these tangents in this conversation, all of us. So how do you kind of center it, focus it in a world that's so busy, and make time and carve out time for writing?
And
Okay.
if I could add one little extra bit to that question, is how to figure out what to write about as it relates to Becker, because his ideas are so central to the human condition and something like terror management theory has gone on to provide illustrations of how deeply embedded death anxiety is within the human condition. So that's what I'd like to add on, is how do you whittle down what to actually include in a book about this man?
Okay, so I'm going to answer the second part first and say the hardest part of the process is and has been and will continue to be throughout this year figuring out what not to write about. Because an entire book could be written about Becker and Rousseau, Becker and Hegel, Becker and Kierkegaard. Those are essentially 2, if not 3 different books already. Okay, that's not to mention his life and its influence. That's not to mention his life as it relates to the modern day. That's not just to mention his thoughts on death. I mean, that could be a whole book in and of itself, right? Or the power we talked about. And these all have tendrils coming off of them with little details along the way. My notes that I've been taking along the way as of last year were somewhere hovering around 170 pages. That's just of literally, oh, what about this? 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 170 pages of that. It's endless. So figuring out what not to write about is the hardest part, and figuring out what is to be included is a huge challenge, So Ian, to your question about how do you write or how do you get started? And I think that when we were offline before we started, you were mentioning that you're interested in writing as well. And I would say to anybody interested in writing a book, whether, about something as immense as Becker's life or something simple, my first question is, how much do you care about your project? And if the answer is, well, I care about it, but I'll answer that in a minute because I'm going to go have a pizza with my friend, I would say, okay, go have the pizza with your friend. Because the answer is, when you care about it the most, that you're willing to shut down everything else, that's when the time to write will simply be what there is in front of you. Like people all the time say, I don't have the time, I don't have the time. I've gone through stretches of months where I haven't had the time to write anything on the book, but it's because I'm making other choices. And sure, I'm doing reading and thinking along the way. Doesn't matter. The hard and fast writing comes when you shut down saying yes to anything that comes along, whether it's a podcast with 2 new friends or the opportunity for pizza, and you just write, and that's what you do. The most productive times I've had on the book were times when I literally shut it all down. There was a stretch last winter where literally 10 days, I just went full bore and churned out 50 some pages, right? And there have been months where I haven't written a word, but I've read interviews and I've read this and I've thought about this and I've written down notes here and there. But the actual hard and fast writing is about Instagram being shut off. I look down because my phone, I immediately think of my phone, get rid of the phone, shut down the instant messages, shut down the text messages, and put your hands on your keyboard. And I'll just add in this, that a very dear friend of mine and I do what we call timed sessions. He will call me, say at 2:00, and he'll say, I'm calling you at 2:30, go. And we hang up, and the deal is nothing else comes in. And then at 2:30, he calls me and says, what have you got? And I said, I just wrote a paragraph about this. And you just put your hands on your keys and you just go, 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 go. Because it's in you. The book's inside you already. You just have to give it the opportunity to come out. And it's not going to come out in terms of writing if your hands are texting over here or doing this over here. It's got to be hands on keys, pen on paper, and going for it.
It's interesting you make those comments because I'm like, oh, they're all good things. They're all good things. I'm like, oh, actually, that's what I did for my PhD thesis. When I had to write up my PhD, that's exactly what I did. I did things like that where I had days and days of flow or days where I couldn't flow. And I was like, right, fuck this. I'm turning off Wi-Fi. I'm turning off everything. Big mug of coffee. And I would set the timer on my phone, but turn off the Wi-Fi and go 45 minutes and just go. Prrr. And if I had to write about cats, dogs, and pigs, it didn't matter. But I was writing something and I had to get the juices flowing. And my rule was if I wasn't typing, I had to write with a pen. I had to be doing something for that 45 minutes. And next minute, it was like you would crack the seal. And that's next minute you would flow and you're like, fuck, this is great. And you would just go right. And you keep actually writing sometimes. And it was in those type of moments where you would find when there's no distractions. And I think artificially I created that by traveling on a plane. I remember one time I was flying from here in Perth in Western Australia to Labrador in Canada. So I had to fly Perth to Sydney, Sydney to Vancouver, Vancouver to Montreal, then do an overnight in Montreal and then fly up to Labrador. And I had to write a 10,000 word assignment for a unit in the Masters of Engineering. And I wrote that whole assignment on that plane because I'd done all my research before I went. And the luxury was I was traveling business class because it was a work thing and work was paying for it. And every flight, I just sat there like, just head down, just typing. And I was all done by the time I got there. And then I had a couple of days of like, get over the jet lag. And then I just did some proofreading and checking of, spelling and so on. But it was that, this was like 11 years ago. And it was that removal of all those distractions that allowed me to focus. It also helped as well that I'd seen all the movies in the plane as well. So I was like, there's nothing here of interest. So I just like focused and had the space. And my wife and I often joke about if you wanted to write a book, maybe you just do a round the world trip and you'll write it in a day, because you're just stuck in it. It's interesting that, to your point, once you make that space and you do it, and it's important, you will do it.
You will do it. I mean, last night I had promised a friend of mine that I would have a chapter to him to just read through by midnight. We'd made this arbitrary promise. And I, around 10 o'clock at night, realized I wasn't going to make the 10 o'clock of the midnight deadline. And I thought, oh, well. And I was like, wait a minute, whoa, what's the oh, well? How does the chapter get written if it's just, oh, well? I'm like, screw that. And I put fingers on keys, and I didn't go to bed until 4 a.m. last night, almost 4 a.m, 3:40 in the morning. But by 3:40 in the morning, I sent off the chapter to my friend saying, hey, I fulfilled my promise to you, right? And the reason that made that possible was I just made the decision that this is happening now. Nothing's getting in the way. And that's how it happens. I mean, it's literally how it happens. And anybody who writes will tell you the same thing. Anybody who creates will tell you the same thing. It's all about just focusing on the task at hand and making it a reality and making it your reality.
Excellent.
Because that reminds me of that awareness of that resistance is so key to the writing process, to be aware that resistance is there, but you have to just keep leaning into it and create that space. It's beautiful.
There's a book by a guy named Stephen Pressfield called The War of Art.
Yeah, I read it. Yeah.
Okay, good. Stephen Pressfield, for people who are unfamiliar, he talks about resistance with a capital R. He's giving it a name as if it's a tangible, palpable presence that will continually push back at your creativity. And he talks the whole book, The War of Art, not The Art of War by Sun Tzu, but The Art of War, Stephen Pressfield. He's talking the entire book about what is our relationship to resistance. And I mean, I can promise you and tell you that if you check in with me 10 minutes after we finish this call, my order of events is turn from here, walk, get a smoothie, and then the second I'm drinking my smoothie, walk directly to the keyboard and start typing. And I'll be typing here for hours and hours if you want to find me. It's definitely the way to do it.
Awesome.
The amount of people, when I recommend that book, go to me, no, I think it's called The Art of War. And I'm like, no, it's The War of Art. And no, it's The Art of War. I'm like, yeah, it's about resistance. Yeah, Sun Tzu, he was a military leader. I'm like, no, it's about the art of, it's about resistance in the arts of writing. No, I think you'll find it. And I'm like, oh, fuck off. Like just Google it backwards. And then they go, oh, it's actually a different book. I'm like, yeah, I told you that 10 minutes ago. That's what I told you. It's a different book. Oh, I didn't realize it was about like art, like as in, oh, fuck. What did I just say to you? I've had that conversation 20 times with people.
Absolutely. It's a fascinating book. Highly recommended.
Yeah, it's very good. Yeah.
The fact that he gave that feeling a term. It just gave it brackets. It just gave it a shape. It's like, oh yeah, this is just that resistance thing that's there now, capital R resistance. And it's fine. That's grand. That's normal. That's cool. That's totally part of the process. Lean into it. Turn off the Wi-Fi. Put the phone on airplane mode and just get stuck in whatever. It's grand. Just like the fact that he gave it. That's the power of language. It's beautiful.
Yeah, it's like in Harry Potter when they name it and then they just don't give it the power. It's the same thing. Greg,
just about everything. Dolphins, Harry Potter, Nazis. I mean, is there anything that we've not covered?
Yeah, we haven't even scratched the surface. You should see when we get going when there's no cameras on. Like I'm dreading the day when me and Ciaran meet face to face, because we'll probably sit there for about 16 days straight, come out looking like crackheads and have no sleep, and God knows what we'll talk about. We go on we were going to call this show Tangents originally. So we go on all ones.
Right. Be sure I get an invite to that party. It sounds like a lot of fun.
Greg, thanks very much for your time today. I really appreciate it. When do we expect maybe to see the book coming out? What's your kind of timeline, and how can people follow your work between now and then?
Sure. Well, people can follow the work and me at gregbennick.com, GregBennick.com. And my Instagram handle is the same. But I'm expecting that a draft of the book will be done by the end of the year. Who knows how long the editing process works. And for those watching in future years, this is the year 2021. So yeah, just keep in touch anytime. If people want to know updates, I'm very accessible. I'm sitting at my computer, and if I don't respond right away, it's because I've shut everything down so that I can write the book. But yeah, this has been great, guys. I really appreciate your time and your inquisitive lines of questions and whatnot. It's been really fascinating. There you go.
Yeah, no, it's been awesome, Greg. I know Ciaran feels the same. I could sit here and talk to you for 10 hours. I'm sure we can go all these rabbit holes. So there's Greg's website. Please go and check it out. Absolutely brilliant. And I actually was as we were doing the conversation as well, I just looked up your band as well. So you've obviously got, was it 3 albums out or more?
Yeah, amongst the bands over the years, there's been, Trial had 3 records, and then Bystander, Between Earth and Sky. The other bands also have, 3-ish records at least between them. So yeah, there's quite a few out there. And so are you on Spotify? Can people listen to your music? Can people find out more about your music endeavors as well? I think so. What's interesting is that over the years, I've never really paid as much attention as I should to whether or not we're on Bandcamp and Spotify. And I think the reason is once the art is created, the way my brain works is I'm thinking, okay, that's out there. Next project, go. And I'm focusing on the next thing and creating the next thing. So I get asked all the time, are you on Spotify? And I always say, I'm not sure. And maybe that's the ADHD, but by the time I think of prioritizing, finding out whether it's on Spotify, I'm on to writing another record or another something. You have your object crafted and tossed in, and it's like, fuck it, whatever. And it's the next object to toss into the confusion. That's it. Did you ever watch the show The West Wing? Oh, yeah. Aaron Sorkin and Martin Sheen played the president. And what I used to love about The West Wing, I did a rerun last year. I was recovering from a surgery, and I did a rerun of all the seasons. I absolutely loved that show. And I love the line that nearly happened in every episode when Martin Sheen, the president, would go, "What's next?" And I'm like, that's fucking brilliant. That is such a great line, because it's like, it's done. It's in the past. Let's move on. Let's not ruminate on it. It's done. What's next? I love that line. What's next? That's it. Along with the laughing in the face of the double bind. I mean, asking what's next. Yeah. For an animal, us, who have the capacity to exist and be creative in the world and develop something of meaning, what's next? I mean, okay, podcast complete, listened to, done, check, moving on. What else can we create? So I would just say, don't die, keep creating, and that could be a mantra for all of us. Beautiful. The end.